A wealthy patient, used to having absolute control over every aspect of his life, is suddenly thrust into a life-or-death crisis that exposes his vulnerabilities in ways he never imagined. When a highly skilled black doctor steps in to save him, the millionaire's ingrained prejudices lead him to make a shocking decision, one that almost costs him everything. But what follows is a complete upheaval of his world. This is a story of survival, self-discovery, and the powerful lessons that emerge when life forces us to confront our most deeply held biases. Ethan Caldwell had always believed he was invincible. From the moment he stepped into the corporate world, he had carved a path built on determination, ambition, and a steadfast belief that anything was achievable through sheer willpower. The world had responded to him in kind. He had risen to the top of his field, amassed wealth, and surrounded himself with people who catered to his every whim. Ethan had no room for weakness or vulnerability, and he prided himself on it. Emotions were a luxury he couldn't afford. He had never allowed himself to be at the mercy of anyone or anything. That was until the day it all came crashing down. Ethan had been in the midst of his usual routine, sitting in a high-rise boardroom, finalizing another lucrative deal when he felt it. At first, it was just a faint discomfort, a tightening in his chest. He brushed it off, assuming it was nothing. He was, after all, a man in perfect health, someone who had taken care of himself, watched his diet and kept fit. Or so he thought. But the pain persisted sharper now, like an invisible weight pressing down on his chest. The room seemed to tilt, and his breath began to quicken. Something wasn't right. "Excuse me," he muttered to his colleagues, his voice betraying an unexpected tremor. As he stood, the room spun, and his legs buckled beneath him. He reached out instinctively, grasping for support, but nothing could stop the fall. It all happened so fast. The next thing he knew, he was lying on the cold, sterile floor of his office, surrounded by the concerned faces of his staff, but none of them could reach him. Not in the way he needed. He could hear their panicked voices calling 911, but even that seemed distant, muffled, as if he were trapped underwater. His pulse raced, each beat thundering in his ears. His thoughts became fragmented. Was this it? Was this how it all ended? Pain. Darkness. The world fading in and out. The ambulance ride to the hospital was a blur. Ethan's eyes fluttered open as he was wheeled through the emergency room doors. The sharp scent of antiseptic filled the air, and he could hear the frantic voices of doctors and nurses moving with urgency around him. His heart felt as though it were being crushed under an unseen force. He wanted to fight it, to regain control, but he was powerless, helpless. For the first time in his life, Ethan Caldwell wasn't in control of anything. The hospital room was a stark contrast to the polished, opulent spaces Ethan was accustomed to. The walls were sterile, the floor a dull linoleum. The beeping of machines echoed in the otherwise silent room. He could feel the cool metal of the hospital bed against his back, and the needles and tubes stuck into his skin felt alien, invasive. The sense of vulnerability was overwhelming. His body, his finely tuned machine, had betrayed him. The door opened, and a man in a white coat stepped in. Dr. Marcus Reynolds was a cardiologist, and he had seen his fair share of heart attacks, strokes, and other medical emergencies. But when he saw Ethan, lying there, pale and weak, he couldn't help but notice the man's air of arrogance that seemed to follow him even in a state of such physical distress. Dr. Reynolds had been in the medical field long enough to know that vulnerability was something people rarely allowed themselves to acknowledge. And in the case of someone like Ethan Caldwell, who had built a fortress around his emotions, this vulnerability would be particularly jarring. "Mr. Caldwell," Dr. Reynolds said, his voice calm and measured, "you're lucky to be alive. It seems you've had a heart attack. We're going to stabilize you, but you need to understand that you're not out of the woods yet." Ethan tried to focus on the doctor's face, but the pain in his chest made it difficult to concentrate. The words felt distant, echoing in his head like a faint drumbeat. Alive? He barely felt alive. He felt numb, disconnected from his own body. "Heart attack," Ethan murmured, as if the term itself were a foreign concept to him. He had heard the word, of course, in passing, but never with such personal significance. For a moment he couldn't process it. It wasn't real. He wasn't supposed to be this vulnerable, this weak. Dr. Reynolds continued to explain the situation, but Ethan's mind was elsewhere. He had spent years building an empire, meticulously crafting his life to ensure that he was always the one in control. He was the one who made the decisions, the one who directed the flow of his existence. To hear that he had suffered a heart attack, something so uncontrollable, so unpredictable, felt like a cruel joke. He had always prided himself on his health, on his strength. Yet here he was, in a hospital bed, at the mercy of machines and doctors he barely knew. A sudden wave of dizziness swept over him, and Ethan's hand instinctively reached up to clutch his chest. The sharp pain returned with full force, and he gasped for breath. "Mr. Caldwell, we need you to stay calm," Dr. Reynolds said, his voice firm but not unkind. "You're in good hands. You need to focus on breathing. The more anxious you get, the harder it will be to stabilize you." But Ethan could barely hear him. His world was spinning, and the pain was unbearable. He was scared in a way he hadn't been since childhood. It was a fear that had nothing to do with his business or his success. This fear was primal, a fear of his own body failing him, of being utterly and completely powerless. As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, Dr. Reynolds worked efficiently, giving orders to the nurses, adjusting machines, and administering medication. Ethan was barely aware of what was happening. His mind kept drifting, swirling between moments of clarity and disorientation. He remembered the faces of his employees, his colleagues, his family, but they all seemed so distant now. His mind was preoccupied with a single thought. How had this happened to him? How had he ended up in this position of helplessness? "I'm sorry," Ethan whispered, barely able to get the words out. He didn't even know who he was apologizing to, Dr. Reynolds, the nurses himself. The admission felt strange, foreign. Ethan had never been the type to apologize. His entire life had been built around self-sufficiency, around never needing to rely on anyone. But now, lying there, vulnerable and frail, the words came unbidden. Dr. Reynolds paused for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought. He had seen many patients, but there was something different about Ethan Caldwell. It wasn't just the wealth or the power that the man seemed to radiate. It was something deeper, a resistance to weakness, a refusal to admit to fragility. But in that moment, as he lay there in a hospital bed, struggling for breath, Ethan Caldwell was no different from any other patient. His power, his success, it meant nothing here. The doctor spoke again, his tone gentle but firm. "You're not the only one who's ever been in this position, Mr. Caldwell. A heart attack doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care how much money you have or how many people depend on you. What matters now is your health, your recovery." Ethan blinked slowly, trying to process the words. The doctor's statement didn't sit well with him. He had always been the one in charge, the one people relied on. He had never thought of himself as vulnerable, and now that he was, the realization felt like a blow to the gut. "I'm not," he began, but the words caught in his throat. He wanted to protest, wanted to argue that he wasn't like everyone else. But in that moment he couldn't. His body betrayed him. His strength, his sense of invincibility was gone. And for the first time in years, Ethan Caldwell felt truly small. The nurse returned to adjust his four, and for a brief moment, Dr. Reynolds stepped out of the room. Ethan lay there, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of it all. How had he let this happen? How had he, a man who had conquered every obstacle in his path, ended up in this hospital bed, dependent on others for his survival? The minutes stretched on, and as his body began to calm, a strange feeling started to creep in, an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: vulnerability. Ethan had spent so long building walls around himself, creating an image of invincibility, that he had forgotten what it was like to be human, to be fragile, to be dependent. The thought lingered, hovering at the edge of his consciousness. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan wasn't sure what to do with it. The sterile whiteness of Ethan's hospital room was both soothing and suffocating. The walls, devoid of character, seemed to close in around him, trapping him in a space where he had no control. No matter how much he tried to distract himself with his phone or the fleeting conversations with nurses and doctors, his mind kept returning to the events of the last 24 hours. He couldn't escape it. The pain in his chest, the frightening uncertainty of his condition, and the sudden, undeniable realization that he was not invincible. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt his own mortality looming over him, and it wasn't a feeling he knew how to handle. He had always been so sure of himself, so confident in his ability to manipulate every situation, to dominate any challenge. Now, lying in a hospital bed with wires and machines keeping him alive, Ethan found himself confronting a truth he had been running from for years. He was just as human as anyone else. The hum of the machine surrounding him was a constant reminder of his vulnerability, a sound that gnawed at his mind as he lay motionless, trying to find some peace in the chaos of his thoughts. The machines beeped rhythmically, offering a sense of stability in the midst of his internal turmoil, but the sound also served to remind him of just how fragile he really was. Each beep felt like a ticking clock, counting down the moments of his life. Time, once something he controlled so easily, now seemed to slip through his fingers like sand. It wasn't just the physical pain that weighed on him. It was the emotional aftermath. Ethan had never been one to deal with emotions. They were a distraction, something to be avoided, stuffed down into the deepest corners of his mind where they could never resurface. He had learned early in life to ignore his feelings, to focus solely on the tangible things that he could control, his business, his wealth, his image. But now, in the aftermath of his heart attack, those feelings bubbled to the surface with no way to stop them. He thought about the people in his life, his colleagues, his employees, and even his family. Did they see him as a man or as a means to an end? How many people around him truly cared for him? Or was he just a tool, a symbol of power and success? The thought gnawed at him, unsettling him in a way that nothing had before. Ethan had always prided himself on being self-sufficient, on never needing anyone. But now, lying in that bed, dependent on a machine to keep him alive, he realized just how empty that self-sufficiency had left him. He had spent his entire life building walls, carefully constructing a persona that could not be broken. Yet in this moment of weakness, he realized that all those walls had done was isolate him from the things that truly mattered. His family, his friends, the real connections that made life worth living. He had pushed them all away in his relentless pursuit of success. The door to his room creaked open, and Ethan's eyes flickered toward the sound. It was Dr. Reynolds again, the same doctor who had been by his side since his admission. The man had a quiet confidence about him, a demeanor that didn't demand respect but commanded it effortlessly. Ethan had noticed it the moment the doctor first walked into his room. There was something about him that felt grounded, solid in a way that Ethan himself wasn't. Dr. Reynolds glanced at the monitors, nodding in approval. His presence was steady, unflinching, as if he were the one in control. "How are we feeling today, Mr. Coldwell?" he asked, his voice calm and measured as always. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in the bed, aware of the vulnerability in his voice. "I've been better," he replied, his tone flat. He didn't feel like talking, didn't feel like answering the usual questions. His mind was elsewhere, still grappling with the whirlwind of emotions he hadn't allowed himself to face. The doctor, however, seemed unfazed by Ethan's reluctance. "It's a long road to recovery," he said, his voice calm but authoritative. "But the fact that you're still here is a testament to your strength." Ethan didn't reply immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze to the window, the bright light of the afternoon sun streaming in through the blinds. The world outside seemed so far removed from the sterile confines of the hospital room. He wondered for the first time in years if he had missed something. If there was something beyond his carefully curated empire that he had ignored. A life outside of business deals and boardrooms. Outside of the power and control he had worked so tirelessly to maintain. Dr. Reynolds, sensing that Ethan was lost in thought, didn't press him for answers. Instead, he sat down on the chair beside the bed, a deliberate move that showed he wasn't just there to be a doctor, but to connect on a human level. "You know," the doctor began, his voice thoughtful, "a lot of people spend their entire lives chasing success, chasing power, without ever stopping to ask themselves why." Ethan didn't look at him. Instead, he stared at the ceiling, lost in the doctor's words. He had never stopped to ask himself why. Why had he worked so hard for all these years? Why had he sacrificed so much? He had always believed that success was the ultimate goal, that it was the answer to everything. But now, in this hospital room, with his life hanging in the balance, he couldn't help but wonder if he had been wrong all along. "You're a man of great influence, Mr. Coldwell," Dr. Reynolds continued, his tone gentle yet firm. "But influence doesn't come from power alone. It comes from the connections you make, the lives you touch. What matters is how you use that influence. Ethan turned his head slightly, just enough to meet Dr. Reynolds's gaze. And what would you suggest I do with it? He asked, his voice tinged with a hint of sarcasm. He wasn't used to being questioned like this. In his world, he was the one who did the asking. He was the one who set the terms. Dr. Reynolds didn't flinch at the challenge. Instead, he smiled faintly, as if he knew exactly what Ethan needed to hear. You have a choice, Mr. Coldwell. You can continue down the same path, building walls around yourself, or you can use this second chance to tear them down. To open yourself up to the world in a way you never have before. It's not easy, but it's possible. But only if you're willing to change. The word struck Ethan like a blow to the chest. Change? He had never considered change before. He had built his entire life around stability, around the belief that control was the key to success. Change meant uncertainty. It meant admitting that he had been wrong all these years. For the first time in a long while, Ethan found himself questioning everything he had ever known. Had he been wrong? Had all of it, the power, the wealth, the success, been for nothing? He didn't know. But in that moment, he realized that he didn't have to have all the answers right now. What mattered was that he was asking the questions. Change, Ethan murmured under his breath, as if the word itself was foreign to him. He repeated it, testing it out, trying to make sense of it. Change. Dr. Reynolds stood up from his chair, preparing to leave. I'll check in on you again soon, he said, his tone softening. But take some time to think about what I said. The choice is yours. As the door clicked shut behind him, Ethan was left alone in the room. The silence that followed was deafening. His mind raced, the words echoing in his thoughts. Change. It was a word that terrified him, yet it also felt like a lifeline. For the first time in a long time, Ethan didn't know what the future held. And for the first time in a long time, that uncertainty didn't seem so terrifying. As the day wore on, Ethan lay in his bed, his thoughts swirling. The machines beeped around him, a constant reminder of his fragile state. But in the midst of it all, something had shifted inside him. It wasn't an answer, not yet, but it was the beginning of something. A crack in the walls he had spent years building. And for the first time, he wondered what might lie beyond those walls. Could he change? Could he truly open himself up to the world in a way he never had before? Ethan didn't know the answer. But for the first time in his life, he was willing to try. Days passed in a blur, each one stretching into the next, with Ethan's world confined to the white walls of his hospital room. The machines beeped and hummed around him, their monotonous sounds becoming the soundtrack to his self-reflection. Time seemed to move in slow motion, but the thoughts racing through his mind were as fast and unpredictable as the current of a river. Ethan had always thought of himself as a man in control, someone who could mold his future with sheer willpower. He had spent his life navigating the labyrinth of business deals, societal expectations, and personal ambition with a kind of precision that made him untouchable. But now, lying in a hospital bed, he was forced to confront the one thing he had spent his entire life avoiding: his own vulnerability. The pain in his chest had subsided, but the emotional toll of his heart attack had not. For the first time, he felt small, almost insignificant in a world that had always revolved around him. But there was something liberating in that realization, something that had begun to crack open the hardened shell he had built around himself. The door to his room creaked open once more, and this time, it was not Dr. Reynolds but someone else. Ethan blinked, startled by the unexpected visitor. It was his sister, Lily, who had come to check on him after receiving the call about his condition. He hadn't expected her to come. She had always been the distant one in the family, the one who had stayed out of his world of power and privilege. She had chosen a different path, one that led her far away from the corporate world Ethan had dominated for years. Lily entered the room with a quiet energy that seemed to fill the space, her gaze soft but steady as it met his. She didn't say anything at first, simply walking over to the chair beside his bed and sitting down with a sigh. Her presence was calming, in stark contrast to the whirlwind of thoughts that swirled in Ethan's mind. "How are you feeling?" she asked after a moment, her voice gentle. Ethan hesitated before answering. He wasn't sure how to express what he was going through. For years, he had kept his emotions locked away, buried beneath the weight of his success and his pride. But now, with Lily sitting before him, he realized that it didn't have to be this way. He could be honest, at least with her. I don't really know, he admitted quietly. I've been thinking about a lot of things. Things I've never let myself think about before. Lily's eyes softened, her expression unreadable. Like what? Ethan shifted in his bed, uncomfortable with the vulnerability that this conversation was bringing. He had never been good at opening up, but something about Lily's calm presence made it feel possible. I've spent my whole life building walls around myself, thinking that power and control were the answers to everything. But now, I'm not so sure. I feel like I've wasted so much time, pushing people away, thinking that I had it all figured out. Lily didn't interrupt, merely listening with a quiet patience that reminded Ethan of how little he had actually listened to others throughout his life. He had always been so focused on his own path, so absorbed in his own success, that he had neglected the people who had always been there for him. You've always been so driven, Lily said after a pause. I get that, but sometimes you need to let go of control. Not everything can be fixed with money or power. Not everything can be controlled. Ethan swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in deeper than he expected. I don't know how to let go, he confessed, his voice thick with emotion. I've never known how. Lily's gaze softened even more, and she reached out to place her hand gently on his. The simple gesture, so unexpected, yet so comforting, made Ethan's throat tighten. He hadn't realized how much he needed something like this, someone to remind him that he wasn't alone, that he didn't have to do everything by himself. You don't have to have all the answers right now, she said softly. You just have to be willing to change. That's the hardest part. Her words hung in the air, and Ethan allowed them to settle into his heart. Change. The very word that had terrified him when Dr. Reynolds first said it was now beginning to feel like a lifeline, a path forward rather than a threat. Do you think it's too late for me? Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lily gave him a gentle smile, one that spoke volumes more than her words ever could. It's never too late to change, Ethan. Not as long as you're still here. You have a second chance, and that's more than most people get. The truth of her words hit Ethan like a wave, and for the first time, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of the second chance he had been given. He had always taken his life for granted, assuming that he had more time to do everything he wanted. But now, time felt finite, precious in a way he had never considered before. As Lily sat with him, they talked about their childhood, about the family they had grown up in, and the dreams they had once shared. Ethan realized how much he had taken their bond for granted, how much he had ignored in favor of his own ambitions. He had built his empire on the backs of others. But at what cost? He had accumulated wealth, power, and success, but he had lost the very things that made life worth living: connection, love, and purpose. The conversation lasted for hours, and as the evening approached, Lily stood to leave, her expression soft but hopeful. I'll check in on you again soon, she said, her voice calm but firm. Ethan nodded, but as she turned to leave, he felt a sense of unease wash over him. There was something in her eyes, something that told him that the conversation wasn't over. That change wasn't going to be easy. He would have to work for it, just as he had worked for everything else in his life. But now, for the first time, he wanted to do the work. After Lily left, Ethan was alone again in the room, the quiet hum of the machines his only companion. His mind was heavy, filled with questions and uncertainties, but also a flicker of hope. He couldn't undo the past, and he couldn't fix everything in a single day. But maybe, just maybe, he could start by being honest with himself. For the first time in years, Ethan began to think about what truly mattered. Not his wealth, not his influence, but the people around him. The ones who had always been there, the ones he had pushed away in his relentless pursuit of success. Dr. Reynolds's words came back to him. You have a choice, Mr. Coldwell. You can continue down the same path, building walls around yourself, or you can use this second chance to tear them down. Ethan knew that change wouldn't be easy. He had spent his life building those walls, and they wouldn't come down overnight. But he was willing to try. He had to be. The man he had been was no longer enough for him. He wanted to be someone else, a man who lived with purpose, with compassion, and with a deeper understanding of what truly mattered. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden light across the room, Ethan closed his eyes and made a promise to himself. It wasn't a promise of instant transformation or grand gestures, but a commitment to do better. To make a difference, not just in the world, but in the lives of those who mattered most to him. And with that, for the first time in years, Ethan Coldwell felt like he was on the verge of something new. A new beginning, built not on power or privilege, but on the simple, powerful truth that it was never too late to change. Months passed since Ethan Coldwell's heart attack, months that had felt like a lifetime. The first days after his discharge had been filled with introspection and uncertainty, but with each passing week, he began to feel a shift within himself. The armor he had once worn so proudly was no longer as heavy, and the walls he had carefully constructed around his heart had started to crack. He wasn't the same man he had been before. He wasn't sure if he would ever fully understand what had driven him to change, but he knew one thing for certain. He could never go back. Ethan had spent a lot of time in the months following his release trying to make sense of everything. He spoke to therapists, read books on self-reflection, and slowly started to reconnect with people he had long neglected. It was painful at first, seeing the people he had wronged, feeling the weight of his past decisions. But there was also something deeply freeing about it. As he opened himself up to those who had once been pushed aside, he began to rebuild the connections he had so callously severed in his pursuit of success. And it wasn't just about his personal life. Ethan had spent a good portion of his career funding initiatives that lined his pockets and built his legacy, but now he wanted to make a real, lasting impact. Something that wasn't about him or his name, but about helping others. Dr. Reynolds' words about using his second chance to make a difference had never felt truer. It wasn't just the moment of awakening after his heart attack that defined him now. It was the actions he took after. It was in the quiet moments when no one was watching. The small decisions he made to put others first, and the deliberate efforts to change his perspective. Every step, no matter how small, mattered. One of the first things Ethan did was call his team at Coldwell Enterprises, the company that had once been his entire identity. He called a meeting with the executives, people who had worked with him for years. They were used to his sharpness, his demands, his cutthroat approach to business. But today, Ethan was different. When the meeting started, they could see it. His posture wasn't as rigid. His tone was softer, less commanding. He wasn't just there to make decisions. He was there to listen. "I've been thinking about something," Ethan began, his voice steady but uncharacteristically vulnerable. "For years, I've been building this company, thinking only about growth and profit. But I've come to realize that real success is about more than just numbers. It's about the impact we make, the legacy we leave behind, not just for our shareholders, but for the communities we touch. I want us to focus on sustainability, diversity, and inclusion in a way we never have before." There was a long silence in the room as his words settled. His team was used to his ambition, but this was something entirely different. For the first time, Ethan wasn't just pushing for expansion. He was advocating for a cause larger than himself. The changes Ethan wanted to implement didn't happen overnight, but he was committed. He launched a new initiative aimed at funding scholarships for underprivileged students who wanted to pursue medical careers, something that had been a personal interest ever since his conversation with Dr. Reynolds. Ethan had always been fascinated by the medical field but had never given it much thought beyond how it could benefit him. Now he realized that he could be part of the solution, part of the movement toward making healthcare accessible to all. Months later, Ethan stood at a podium at a scholarship gala, the weight of his journey resting on his shoulders. The room was filled with influential figures from the world of business, medicine, and education. He had been invited to speak, not as the CEO of Coldwell Enterprises, but as someone who had transformed, someone who had found a purpose beyond profit. Ethan took a deep breath as he adjusted the microphone. His heart pounded in his chest, not from fear, but from a sense of responsibility. He had come a long way from the man who had once measured success only in terms of wealth. Now he understood that true fulfillment came from making a positive difference. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice steady and confident. "When I first started out in business, I thought I had it all figured out. I was focused on making money, building an empire, and ensuring my legacy. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what really mattered. I lost sight of the people who didn't have the opportunities one had. I lost sight of the impact my actions had on others." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "I was wrong," Ethan continued. "I've had the privilege of a second chance at life, and with that privilege comes a responsibility. A responsibility to do better, not just for myself, but for others. That's why I've committed to funding scholarships for students who may not have the financial means to pursue a medical career but have the passion and the potential to make a difference in the world. This is just the beginning, but I hope that by helping these students, we can create a ripple effect of change, one that extends beyond the walls of this room and into communities that need it most. The applause that followed was loud, but Ethan barely heard it. His mind was somewhere else, reflecting on everything that had brought him to this point. He had spent so many years building walls around his heart, keeping people at arm's length, thinking that power was the answer. But now he realized that the real power lay in his ability to connect, to give, and to inspire others to do the same. Later that evening, as the gala came to a close, Ethan found himself standing outside, looking out over the city skyline. The lights of the city twinkled below him, but they didn't hold the same allure they once had. He didn't crave them anymore. What he craved now was something simpler, something deeper, purpose. As he stood there, a familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. "You did well tonight," Dr. Reynolds said, stepping out from the shadows. The doctor had attended the event, as he often did, to show support for the scholarships Ethan had established. Ethan turned to face him, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I couldn't have done it without you, you know." Dr. Reynolds gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. "It's not about me, Mr. Coldwell. It's about what you've chosen to do with the second chance you've been given." Ethan paused, letting the doctor's words sink in. The journey was far from over, but he finally understood that change wasn't something that happened all at once. It was a process, and it was a process he was willing to embrace. "You're right," Ethan said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "It's about what I do now, and I plan to make it count." Dr. Reynolds smiled faintly, offering a nod of approval. "Good, because change, no matter how hard, is the most important thing we can do. It's never too late to make a difference, Ethan." As the evening wound down and the last guests trickled out of the gala, Ethan felt a sense of peace settle within him. He had no illusions about the future. There would be setbacks, challenges, and moments of doubt, but for the first time in his life he knew what mattered. He knew what his true purpose was. It wasn't about being the wealthiest man in the room, or the most powerful. It was about using the privilege he had to make the world a better place for those who didn't have the same opportunities he had. It was about building bridges, not walls. And as Ethan Coldwell stood there, looking out over the city that had once seemed like the center of his universe, he realized that he was finally free. Free from the chains of his past, free from the ego that had driven him for so long, and free to live a life that was about something much bigger than himself. Change was not just possible, it was inevitable, and Ethan was ready to embrace it.